I hope to make it a little bit more encouraging than that today and capture your attention. But it's giving back to God. And giving back to God is more than just money. It entails our prayers, our heart, our time, and I think that's probably one of the hardest things for us today in America, is to give of our time. I know we just seem so busy, but God expects that for us. He wants that from us, for us to give back of our time. And also it has to do with our physical efforts, and just so many aspects of our lives we are to give back to God. But this is now, and it's always been a very giving congregation. I think that's one of our strengths. When I look at our personality and those strengths that we have, we've always risen to the challenge, and we've always just given so freely. Many times we give to things that you don't see reflected in the budget, and that surprises me, and sometimes we forget about those things. But go to the next slide. This is the exciting part. This is a spreadsheet of the 2012 budget and the 2013 budget. 2012, this congregation had a budget of $292,725. There was a decrease in the upcoming 2013 budget of 6.5%, which equals to $18,980, about $19,000 decrease in the 2013 budget. If you will notice, and speaking of that, anyone that wants a copy of this, okay, Mark just says they're on the foyer, or if you will see me, I will be glad to get a copy to you. And if you have questions, I want to encourage you to start by going to the deacon or the ministry leader that's over that work, because they probably are more accurate and know more about that work than an elder would, because they deal with it every day or every week. But we certainly want to be open, and anyone that wants a copy of the budget, we'll certainly give you access to parts or all of it. But and Mark, as Mark said, there's copies out on the foyer if you want to take a look at that. If you'll notice, there are two major areas of increase, which are in the benevolence and capital expense. Benevolence was the least amount of increase in those two areas, with $2,000. But we increased benevolence simply because there's a lot of people that are hurting. And there are families that we try to help within this congregation and locally that are just going through a tough time. So the elders and the deacons felt that it was a good thing, even though we're reducing the budget overall, if we would increase those areas slightly so that we can continue to help people. And also included in benevolence is the counseling work that Karen Fitzpatrick does. We wanted to be able to help our members that need counseling in times of crisis and be able to help them out a little bit. And it's much healthier to have that budgeted than it is to try to take from another line item and use it that way. So those are the two areas that showed an increase. Also, we're able to meet this budget primarily because of not funding the minister and youth minister's salary at the beginning of this year. So next year it will be even more of a challenge for us to meet budget and yet still continue all the good works that we do. And we do a lot of them, both those that are in the budget and those not listed in the budget. So next year is going to be a challenge also. Let's take a moment and just look at the activities that we have taken part of in 2012 where we have given back to God. And I would just have name those. We had a ladies' retreat in October that several of our members and people in the local area enjoyed. We also had the 60th anniversary celebration. And if we just witnessed on this slide is Children's Church. And I think that is a huge thing that we've started that requires our efforts. And it goes hand in hand with our focus being on children, teens, and young families. And we do realize that that's so very important, but Children's Church is a big part of that. That goes hand in hand with our family focus that we did in the summer, one night a month, where we would have the inflatables and just to encourage young families to come out and spend time together. We would have a devotional and a meal and spend time with the kids with the watermelon spitting contest and those type things. Many of you were involved in the Magi Boxes, which is a project that we do that items like pencil and paper and small toys are put in a plastic shoebox. They're taken to Healing Hands in Nashville, and then they distribute them in Honduras to needy children at Christmas, oftentimes to kids that would not have Christmas any other way. So that's a good work that we are involved in. I don't think it's listed directly on our budget, but a ministry that has been a pleasant surprise to me is the bus ministry. And I hope I don't leave anyone out. You have Kent, Mark, Bill Fitzpatrick, I believe Jim and Chuck take part in that. And that just, the reason it was a pleasant surprise for me, it just kind of sprang up one day. There was a need for it to transport some of our members, and these men took part of it and made it their own, and it's just been a bright spot, I think, in things this congregation have taken on. But I want to thank them, and again, it's been a bright spot for me. This next slide is our mission group in Honduras, and last week we heard a lot about missions, both Sunday morning and Sunday night, but we work all over the world, and we touch all over the world, both in Thailand, Ethiopia, Russia, just lots of places, and we want to continue doing that. An area or a project that some of you may be aware of and may not be aware of is our technology. We have the ability to stream live the worship service on Sunday morning. It's also archived where you can go back during the week and look at it. We have some pretty amazing capabilities as far as technology, and I want to thank Blaine and Jonathan for that. If you get an opportunity, sometime ask them about it. Ask them what we're capable of doing. The elders participated in a webinar a few months ago that we went to the annex and had a live webinar that we watched on the flat screen television. So we can do some things that maybe we don't think about. If you will go to the annex on the fourth Sunday most months, you will find a group of ladies working on ugly quilts. And this is where they sew a sort of a sleeping bag and give to the homeless. And I can imagine there'll be people that are going to be warm tonight and tomorrow night because of what our ladies have done. Just going along with this was a surprise to me. If you look in your bulletin, you'll find this green list of things that the Pathfinders are using for the food backpacks. This is not listed. Again, there's so much that this congregation does that doesn't show up on the budget, and we just want to say thank you. And last but not least, last simply because I put it in alphabetical order, was the youth group and youth activities. They do a lot. You know, they've got the upcoming Winterfest that they go to. They went to in 2012, and they go to each year. And from my understanding, they had a game night last night. I think Deborah read on Facebook here in the annex where the youth came together in the annex and played games. So there's many times there are things that are happening here at the church, at the congregation, that some of us are aware of and some of us aren't, but there's a lot of activity. And then we cannot neglect just the day-to-day operational expense. Sometimes we forget about that. For me to come here this morning and walk through an unlocked door, somebody paid for the key. We have the heat, the water, you know, just those things that we take for granted, but it does take quite a bit, just the operational expenses of this congregation. 2012 was a challenging year, but it was a good year, again, because we did not have to significantly reduce any projects or services that we take part in. And I am optimistic about 2013. I think it's going to be a good year, and I'm just very hopeful and look forward to being part of it. And I want to say thank you for all the people that have both given their time and their effort and make these things happen. Now we're going to hear a little bit from Lloyd about giving back to God.
I'm sure you noticed there weren't a whole lot of figures put up there on the board, and that was done intentionally. We want all of us to be thinking more about what that money that we give on a week-to-week basis is accomplishing and what it's doing, as well as a lot of other things that are going on. The first couple of verses of Psalm 24 reads like this: "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, for he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." Everything belongs to the Lord. Bob emphasized that this morning in the contribution, when he talked about our contribution. And I didn't ask him to do that, but it ties right in with what I'm saying here at this point. That's what that passage from Psalm 24 says. When you place your contribution in the collection plate, you're not giving to God, you're giving back to him, because everything in this earth and on this earth was all his to begin with. And so when we talk about the church budget and your part in it, as we are this morning, the title in the bulletin for this part of the service is appropriate: Giving Back to God. Very rarely do you hear sermons from this pulpit, or have ever heard sermons from this pulpit, about money and possessions or about giving. You probably remember a few, but it's rarely ever said. And that's true of most churches, I think. Usually that happens once a year at budget presentation time, as we're doing here today. But did you know that Jesus spoke more about money than any other subject? At least I've read that in several religious articles. I've never bothered to go in and start enumerating all of those verses, but I think that's probably the case. He spoke more about money and possessions than any other subject. Take as an example the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Matthew. 5, 6, and 7, rather, of Matthew, which has a few verses at least with this theme. Verse 19 of chapter 6 begins with these words: "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up treasures in heaven." And then after a little further discussion of that thought, he ends with these words in verse 24: "No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." You know, perhaps in the fact that Jesus said a lot about money and possessions, he realized something that we do not. And that is this: that our attachment to the world, especially in relation to our possessions, is not as clear-headed and heavenly minded as we would like to think. And so his words were designed, I think, in what he said in the New Testament about it, were designed to cause us to reconsider and to be guided by a better standard. When I think of giving, as it's related in the Bible, I think about three outstanding, if you will, instances. There may be more, but these came to my mind. The first comes from the Old Testament, shortly after the Israelites had escaped from slavery in Egypt and were getting ready to build the tabernacle with all its furnishings. And we read in Exodus chapter 25, in the first few verses, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from each man whose heart prompts him to give. These are the offerings you are to receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and hides of sea cows, acacia wood, olive oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and breastpiece. Then have them make a sanctuary for them, and I will dwell among them.'" In the chapters following this, the Lord gave instructions about how to build this tabernacle that he wanted them to make. And then in Exodus 35, we read where this work began. And in the very next chapter, in verse 36 and verses 6 and 7, we read these words that I think are challenging words for us today. It says this: "Then Moses gave an order, and they sent this word throughout the camp: 'No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary.' And so the people were restrained from giving, or from bringing more, because what they already had was more than enough to do all of the work." It's amazing, isn't it? Israel was on, if you will, a kind of adventure. Slavery was behind them, and they were looking forward to a future in a new land with Jehovah God. And they were beckoned to that future in working with God. And so they gave, and they gave generously, exceptionally generously. Many congregations in our world today are generous in their giving, including this one, as some things that Sam pointed out a few moments ago. And that's especially true, I think, sometimes when a special contribution is taken up for a special need. But I don't think I ever heard of a situation where the membership of a church was asked to quit giving because everything that was needed and even more, or had been budgeted, had been collected. The second instance that I think of when I think of giving is found in Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44, a passage that I know you're all familiar with, the story anyway. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. You know, from a very human standpoint, we generally applaud those who give large amounts of money, even though their generous gift wouldn't change their lifestyle one iota. But we applaud that, and I think that's all right. But the only reason they gave big is because they had more than enough to begin with. And I think that's what Jesus is pointing out here. Jesus seems to have judged generosity on a different basis than what we normally do from a human standpoint. I don't know what motivated the woman to give so generously as she did. The Bible doesn't say. But I do wonder if it might have been something like a story that was sent to me by a friend way back in 1998. It's called The Rich Family in the Church. And I suppose that it's a true story. I don't know whether the man who sent it to me knew this man or not, but the title is in the man's name is given here, the title, The Rich Family in Church by Eddie Ogden. And here's what he said. I'll never forget Easter 1946. I was 14, and my little sister, Osie, was 12, and my older sister, Darlene, 16. We lived at home with our mother, and the 4 of us knew what it was to do without many things. My older sisters were married, and my brothers had left home. My dad had died about 5 years before, leaving Mom with 7 children to raise and no money. A month before Easter, the pastor of our church announced that a special Easter offering would be taken to help a poor family. Well, he asked everyone to save and to give sacrificially, and when we got home, we talked about what we could do. We decided to buy 50 pounds of potatoes and to live on them, and by the way, he meant just those potatoes, for a month. This would allow us to save $20 of our grocery money for this offering. Then we thought that if we kept our electric lights turned out as much as possible and didn't listen to the radio, television wasn't really around at that time, and we didn't listen to the radio, we'd save money on that month's electric bill. Darlene got as many house and yard cleaning jobs as possible, and both of us babysat for everyone we could. For 15 cents, we could buy enough cotton loops to make 3 potholders to sell for $1. We made $20 on potholders. That month was one of the best of our lives. Every day we counted the money to see how much we had saved. At night, we'd sit in the dark and talk about how the poor family was going to enjoy the money the church would give them. We had about 80 people in church, so figured that whatever amount of money we had to give, the offering would surely be 20 times that much. After all, every Sunday, Pastor reminded us to save for this sacrificial offering. So the day before Easter, Osie and I walked to the grocery store and got the manager to give us 3 crisp $20 bills and 1 $10 bill for all the money we had saved. We ran all the way home to show Mom and Darlene. We had never had so much money before. That night, we were so excited, we could hardly sleep. We didn't care that we didn't have new clothes for Easter. We had $70 for the sacrificial offering. We could hardly wait to get to church. On Sunday morning, rain was pouring. We didn't own an umbrella, and church was over a mile from home, but it didn't seem to matter how wet we got. Darlene had cardboard in her shoes to fill the holes, and that came apart, and her feet got wet. We sat in the church with our old clothes, some teenagers talking about how the Smith girls still had on their old dresses, but we felt rich. When the sacrificial offering was taken, we were sitting on the second row from the front. Mom put in the $10 bill, and each of us kids put in a 20. As we walked home from church, we sang, all the way. At lunch, Mom had a surprise for us. She had bought a dozen eggs, and we had boiled Easter eggs with our fried potatoes. Later that afternoon, the minister drove up in his car. He gave Mom an envelope. When she came back in, she didn't say a word. She opened the envelope, and out fell some money. There were 3 crisp $20 bills, a $10 bill, and 17 $1 bills. Mom put the money back in the envelope. We didn't talk. We just sat and stared at the floor. We had gone from feeling like millionaires to feeling like poor white trash. The minister had brought us the money for the poor family, so we must be poor. I didn't like being poor. I looked at my dress and worn-out shoes and felt so ashamed. I looked at how I was dressed and worn-out shoes and felt so ashamed. I didn't even want to go back to church. Everyone there must know we were poor. We didn't even want to go to church for the same reasons. And so the next Sunday we didn't want to go to church, but Mom said we had to. Although it was a sunny day, we didn't talk on the way. Mom started to sing, but no one joined in. She only sang one verse. At church we had a missionary speaker. He talked about how churches in Africa made buildings out of sun-dried bricks, but they needed money to buy roofs. He said $100 could put a roof on a church. Minister said, "Can't we all sacrifice to help these poor people?" We looked at each other and smiled for the first time in a week. Mom reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. She passed it to Darlene. Darlene gave it to me, and I handed it to Ossie, and Ossie put it in the offering. When the offering was counted, the minister announced that it was a little over $100. The missionary was excited. He hadn't expected such a large offering from our small church. He said, "You must have some rich people in this church." Suddenly it struck us. We had given $87 of that little over $100. We were the rich family in the church. The missionary had said so. From that day on, I've never been poor again. I've always remembered how rich I am because I have Jesus. That story touched me a lot. I know it took a little bit more time than maybe it needed to, but I just felt with the things we wanted to say, it fit so appropriately. The third instance of generous giving that I think of from the Bible is found in 2 Corinthians. The inspired Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and he was urging them, among other things, to finish taking up their promised collection for the poor Christians in Judea who were suffering from a famine in that region. And as part of his rationale, Paul offers the example of the Macedonian churches. You know, I'm sure you're familiar, with this story. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verses 1 through 5, Paul wrote this to the church at Corinth, "And now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches." God has given a grace to these Macedonian churches. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. And they did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us, in keeping with God's will. The churches in Macedonia obviously were poor, from what Paul says right here, but they saw a greater need in the fact that a famine was going on in Judea and the brethren there were suffering from it. So they saw a need, and they rose to help meet it. A couple of final thoughts. Walt Fitzgerald was one of the converts we had while in New England. Formerly Catholic, he told of putting a quarter into the poor box at the Catholic Church every Sunday. Never failed, always put in a quarter. After becoming a New Testament Christian, he upped that to $1 every time the contribution plate was passed. And so now he was giving 4 times what he had done before, and he was feeling pretty good about himself. Well, then one day he helped count the contribution. He saw $5 bills, $10 bills, $20 bills, checks for the same amount, even one for $50. And there were only 2 families in the church at that time might be considered money people, and it totally blew him away. Well, I don't know what he gives today, but I'm pretty sure that it's more than $1. You know, as we think about the ancient Israelites giving generously in order to build the tabernacle, they had something in mind that it was accomplishing, and that's what we've tried to emphasize this morning, is what the dollars accomplish. And so they had that in mind. But as we think about those ancient Israelites doing that, and we think about the Macedonian churches giving generously so that they could help the poor saints in Jerusalem and Judea that were suffering from the famine, let us think about what our church is doing as well and proposing to do, as seen in our budget, and be similarly generous in our giving. There may be somebody here this morning who's not yet a Christian. You have not yet given yourself to the Lord, as Paul suggested to the Corinthian brethren, not given yourself to the Lord, first of all, in being immersed in the waters of baptism, to join with Christ Jesus there in his death and burial and resurrection. And if you haven't done that, you have an opportunity to do it this morning. If, on the other hand, you need the prayers of someone of the brethren here for yourself or others, please come and let us help you with that while together we stand and sing.
Of God.